Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. And we are in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I am your host, Pavini Moray. And today I am so excited to introduce you to Peter Touchard. And his main passion is to really help people recognize their inherent ability to create, change, grow, and heal. And he does this by helping his clients access deeper parts of themselves using systemic constellation work and neurolinguistic programming, and by sharing what he's learned from indigenous wisdom traditions over his 7+ years of personal experience. And by remembering our deeper connections to our inherent wisdom, we become more conscious agents of change in our own lives. And so we're going to talk a lot about family constellations today and that modality as it relates to the topics of the threads that I'm weaving. And you can find out a lot more information about Peter and his work on his website, which is www.petertouchard.com. It's PeterTouchard.com. Hi, Peter. Welcome.
Hi, Pavni. Thanks for having me.
Totally. So excited to have a chance to speak with you today. I know a little bit about family constellations and the process. I've done some of the work. I know that a lot of people who are listening to the podcast probably won't have any grounding in family constellations and how that relates with ancestors. So I was hoping that you would just give some background context about what family constellations are and systemic constellations. I'm using those two terms interchangeably. Maybe I'm doing that incorrectly. Please correct me if so. But just giving some background context would be great.
Great. Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to do so. So family and systemic constellations, and you can definitely use those either way. Essentially, a family is a system as far as systemic constellations are concerned. It's a modality that is specifically designed to help shift unconscious transgenerational trauma. It was developed by a German psychotherapist named Bert Hellinger, who was a missionary actually in Africa back in the day. And as the stories go, from his time down there, he hung out with the Zulu people and he observed their ancestral rites and just came to this realization on his own that the ancestors might actually still be a part of our lives. The ritual inclusion of ancestral rites in the daily lives of the Zulu people really changed his perspective. And then he came back home. He's from Germany. He was in Europe. There's a little bit of mystery around what happened for about 20 years, but at some point he came out with this modality that is an embodied way of actually accessing unconscious systemic information, or specifically feeling the impact of our family systems when it's not really your family. And so a typical constellation is going to be done on behalf of a person, normally, and it's going to be on behalf of that person's family, and usually around a specific experience they're having that might be really stuck. I've seen it done for people who've had mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, or people who have had this maybe a pervasive feeling of just not wanting to be here, literally wanting to check out of life. And even actually someone who had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years with no effect. And they had constellations done on behalf of them and their family. And constellations are done generally in a group format, which I'll go into in a minute. But people show up to participate in these constellations, generally for strangers, for people that they don't know, which is really fascinating if you think about it, this community healing process that's really asks people to show up outside of their own healing journey to help support others. But these constellations were done for these people to help affect change. And what we find when we go and do a constellation is that there are often, many times, different traumas or entanglements in the past that help keep some of our circumstances stuck. So I can say with the people with the mysterious illnesses, oftentimes you'll find an entanglement with someone or something in the past, where being sick seems to be the best option to stay connected to, or in service to, or loving to the family system. And for the woman who was actually looking to get pregnant, actually a year after her constellation, she had a baby girl. So we hear these kinds of amazing stories of how these things that have been really stuck for so long are easily able to shift for people once they have had a constellation, which helps both reveal some of the entanglements and what's stuck beneath the surface, and also revise. It creates an opportunity for healing and shift to happen. And so I look at it as we're tapping into the unconscious of the family soul, or the family system. These are words that get used a lot in the family constellations community, family soul. So this idea that those that we're connected to and in relationship to, we have an ethereal, non-physical connection to them that transcends space and time, that we are still impacted by. And you see this a lot. The science is actually catching up with some of this too, as far as epigenetics, trauma that is sort of carried on genetically from generation to generation, specifically with survivors of the Holocaust, and also people who've survived great wars and tragedies. So constellations is a way to work with some of that.
That's a great answer. Yeah. And I think that like what I want to draw out is that when we're talking about things that exist, like we can see the impact of transgenerational trauma if we look through that lens, right, on our lives.
Yeah.
But yet we can't, it's like the direct correlation. It's like, it's not something I can pick up and hold, right? It's like, it's a little bit woo, right? And I like that you said that the science is catching up, because absolutely it is.
Yeah.
And, when I encountered family constellations work, like I was pretty skeptical, about it because of it's like we're going to talk, I know, a little bit about the field and what that is, the healing knowing field.
Mm-hmm.
And so like there's kind of like a leap of faith that you have to make what's that, suspension of disbelief, right? To kind of buy into like, oh, how could this thing that seems like, it's just people who are in this room together, kind of working on this tangly mess of a family situation, how could that actually create change in the family situation? And I want to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to say that just in my personal experience of kind of getting to a point in my family experience it just felt like impossibly stuck. And like everything I was doing to shift it wasn't shifting it. Having a family constellation shifted it really quickly in really noticeable, tangible ways.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's, it's a both and situation, and just kind of wanting to like, to really call out that like even, like I think I said it. So I want to ask you about family systems, because I don't think it's a idea that most people necessarily kind of have in the forefront of their brain of like what even is a family system. And then you talked about them getting stuck and entangled. So I would love just to have a little bit more about that, and then kind of how do they start to heal?
Sure. I can actually just make one little point about the skeptical piece, because
absolutely, yeah.
I came into this with no. I historically was a fairly low woo person. Like I knew woo was there. I was fairly comfortable with it being somewhere else. I wasn't super, cynical about the possibility of experiences outside of my own awareness. But I will say that I came to constellations having no idea what was happening. But I have been learning to trust my own experience. And this is one of the things I think that's really great about constellations is it's all experiential. So when you are participating in a constellation, there's a mechanical piece we haven't talked about yet, which is what happens in a constellation with representatives and all of that. I'm not sure if we want to get into that right now, but just lightly, when you're representing in a constellation, you are literally just noticing your feelings and noticing your attention and your body. Like, that's all you have to do. And what we find is that when we are coming together in an intentional way, information just shows up, feelings just show up. My very first constellation, I remember looking at this woman who I'd never met before. While I had a role being, I think it was my friends, I was representing in my friend's constellation. I was his dad, and the woman over there was my friend. And just looking at them, and I'm like, I don't know exactly why, but I really love you. Like, just having this experience of looking at a complete stranger, only in the context of the constellation, they weren't a stranger. I had a feeling connection, a relationship with them. That information, for whatever reason, seems to be accessible. And even if you're, if you're willing to step in and have an experience and whatever it is, it's a very accessible form of work, in my opinion. I think the hardest part is if you try to go into it with trying to figure it out and try to understand it and make it fit into the box, you might have a hard time. But if you just show up and allow it to introduce itself to you, it can be really easy to just sort of sink in. I also, when I do representations with people, I generally I have the roles are hidden. So I will know maybe who people are, but the representatives themselves will not. So the idea is to help keep the mind out of the interpreting, understanding, fitting into a box, and just allowing the role or the representation to show up. So
let's talk a little bit about the mechanics, because I think it might be helpful to just have a little bit more context. So basically, like, I show up, there's a group of people there, maybe some of them I know, some of them I don't know. And if I'm going to have the constellation done, I've worked with the facilitator ahead of time, right? To kind of like explicate what I'm wanting to work on and get unstuck. So the facilitator knows. And then the facilitator, there's that process of like the role assignment, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about what happens next?
Yeah, sure. So I've done an interview with the client. I've generally got a sense of the people in the family that may or may not be directly connected to the stuck experience or the issue. And there may be other big energies, like the energy of war or the energy of a country or particular experiences that kind of have a role or play a piece in the larger puzzle. And I will feel into which of these feels the most relevant for what we're working with. I'll write the role on a card generally. Some people do this differently. They'll either just tell the people who they are, or you can even just tap them with the role. A teacher of mine likes to sort of intentionally put the role into his hand and throw it at the representative across the room. There's lots of different ways that people do it. But I write it on a piece of paper, fold the paper up, and give it to a volunteer who wants to represent in the constellation. They do not know who they are until later. We'll usually do a reveal about somewhere between a quarter of the way and halfway through the constellation. So it's people get those roles, which are usually, again, family members or the client or particular flavor of issue. Like if someone had insomnia, you might put insomnia on a piece of paper, because it's all about relationship. Constellations, if there's anything they're about, it's about relationship and how things relate to each other. That gets played out. People notice their experience, report out to me. I will ask questions. Sometimes I'll have the representatives say things to each other. Through that process, things get revealed. Things get shifted. It just sort of depends on what we're dealing with.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So kind of going back to the question that I asked a little bit ago, which is like, what are the kind of things that get stuck in families?
Yeah. So one of the core, in my world, really a core driver of human experience, there's a couple. One of them is love. To love and be loved and feel love is a big one. One of them is belonging. And our first sort of group in which we belong with is our family. And whether we actually consciously feel like we belong with our family, many of us sometimes have an experience of feeling, almost from like a different universe or generation or tribe, from our family. at a core deep level, we do actually always belong with our family. And what we'll find in constellations often is out of a desire of the client, usually, to belong to the family or to try and make it better for those who have died, they will get entangled with things that have happened in the past. And I want to just say this doesn't usually happen consciously. It's very rare that a client is coming to me and saying, you know, I heard that there was this murder in my family, and I really just want to make sure that the victim is held properly, or in other cases, or the perpetrator is seen and included as part of the family. So I'm just going to get myself all in a mess and make sure that I stay entangled with this. Like, it's never conscious.
Oh my God, I wish it was that clear.
Right? Wouldn't that be great? I mean, that would be so
Totally.
easy. And it does sometimes get that clear. Like, occasionally you'll notice like a family that you can just look and say, wow, this really, really looks like it's connected to this thing over here. And oftentimes it is, but part of the whole process of doing a constellation is it's the unseen things that get the most sticky. So a lot of constellations is revealing that which has been, either consciously hidden or hidden through time or excluded. Exclusion is one of the biggest sort of causes of an entanglement. It's almost a guarantee that if someone in your family, alive or dead, has been cut out, excluded, cast aside, that they will be or can potentially be a sticking point to getting some family member at some point in time entangled with them. Because it's the inclusion maneuver, it's including the belonging sort of function. That's what the family soul sort of craves for healing. And when we try to cut stuff out or send people away, we don't like that. We will deliberately get entangled with them so that they're represented. I myself have had this happen in my own constellations quite a bit. Almost every single person who's ever been cast out of or disrespected in my family, I have found some way in which I've been entangled with them. It's really funny. So,
would another name for this be traumatic repetition?
I'm not, So I'm not familiar with sort of the host of contexts in which that might be held, but it does seem to describe some of the experience. It's not always so direct, is the only thing. Like, it's not always a direct repetition of a trauma that happened before in such an easy way to see it.
Right.
But connected to, for sure, because sometimes it's on the other end of the trauma. So if you're, so say the trauma was perpetrated inside of your family. There's a way in which we get entangled, sometimes with the victims, but also with the perpetrators. And not in a condemning, blaming way, but in a belonging, loving way, right? Where the feeling maybe of shame or exclusion or whatnot, it's held in the wholeness of the trauma, so both the perpetrator and victim, and so we might end up with either part of that. Does that make sense? So it's not always easily translatable as I'm receiving the perpetrator version of the trauma, but it might be I'm connected to the victim version of the trauma, but I'm connected to the perpetrator version of the drama. I'm not sure if that's super clear.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think what's coming up is there's this book called The Ancestor Syndrome by Anne Enselin Schustenberger, and in that she just talks about like exactly what you're talking about how wounds love to heal, right? That's a line from a song that my friend Thea wrote, is like, if it's not addressed in the generation, whatever generation it happens in, it will repeat in some way. There will be an entanglement in some way.
Yeah.
And exactly what you're saying, it's like, it's really confusing when you are working out your ancestors' stuff, right? It's like, it doesn't make sense exactly. So, and I do think that constellations are beautiful in that how they make that visible. Like, what part of this addiction that I'm dealing with is mine, and what part am I working this out for one of my ancestors?
Exactly, and it's actually a really wonderful experience to be, wonderful, and also sometimes it's like someone just read you. You're sitting there in the front of the room, and you're looking at maybe 6 or 8 strangers, people, or a friendly face or two, and you're seeing your family dynamic played out in front of you. And that family dynamic is the internal structure of a dynamic that you've been playing out to some degree. Like, it's just, there's a lot of recognition of how we carry this stuff forward by going through a constellation process. It's really quite astonishing.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of leads to talking a little bit about how particular energies like addiction, like violence, like predation, sexual violence, sexual, how do those things get attached to bloodlines so that, it's happening in generation after generation after generation? Would you say that this is like it's a good way to look at it? Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting too, because it's kind of like with any sort of trauma, not every big experience or every violent experience automatically codes as trauma. Some of them do and some of them don't, right? Like, you could get into some people, have gone into like a car accident, for example, and maybe they've come out of it with some kind of residual PTSD or trauma symptoms. And other people, for whatever reason, they go into the car accident and they come out the other side and they don't seem to have anything lasting. Family trauma is kind of like that. It's hard to predict automatically that, well, this particular issue in the family, whether it be, incest or violence perpetrated within the family or to the family from without, or in some cases from within the family, outside the family. So if you have a murder in the family, you killed someone or killed people outside, the way all of that gets coded is going to depend on the family. And the way we work with constellations is they're outcome based. So we're working with a particular issue and we allow that to guide where in the family the resonance is. So for myself, I've done probably about 5 or 6 constellations. And as you do them more, you get a sense kind of for where things are. And I found that some of the stuff that I thought would be a really big factor in a particular issue weren't. And some things that I didn't even know about, some traumatic experiences in my family that no one ever talked about, especially the ones that no one ever talked about, are the ones that actually are having the most impact for where I am now. So I would say that there's a good chance that if the trauma isn't processed or dealt with or felt or included in a generation, that you're more likely to have it causing problems in the generations after. And oftentimes it'll skip a generation. So, we'll often find that we're having experiences of our grandparents' generation, but not always. So there's no hard, fast rules, but I would say, like regular trauma in our own personal lives, if it stays unresolved and stuck, then it's probably going to stay unresolved and stuck for a while until it shifts.
There's something that I want to draw out that you said, which is stories of trauma or traumatic experiences that get coded that are never talked about, right? That it's unresolved because it hasn't been talked about. And just in my research about intergenerational trauma, transgenerational trauma, like silence is one of the ways that trauma does get passed through the generations, right? There's been a lot of research with, like, as you said, second and third generation and now fourth generation of Holocaust survivors, and that the silence is actually the mechanism.
Absolutely.
Right. And that it just feels really important, because I think basically what family constellations are doing is breaking silence. It's like, let the unseen be seen. And it's the same, that's the modality, but there's other ways, I think, also to do that. But it's like that the silence is actually quite toxic.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to draw that out. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about fields and like what the field is? And because, that's a jargony thing that gets thrown around, and in particular, cultural and social fields.
Sure. Yeah, you bet. So this is the $1 million question, right? What is the field? You will hear constellations practitioners talk about the field. Sometimes it's the knowing field, or the healing field. I generally try not to say the field. I mean, I guess I do say it often enough, but for me, the field is generally the field of human consciousness, but differentiated. So what do I mean when I say that? For some reason, with our bodies, we seem to be able to connect to a field effect, a greater area of non-physical influence, of information, of feeling, of data, however you want to look at it. We can experience this through constellations. If you're familiar with Rupert Sheldrake, you might have heard of the field of morphic resonance, or the morphic field. This is an observable phenomenon. In his scientific studies, what they discovered is that there's these monkeys, right, on different islands, and they found that if one set of monkeys who is completely disconnected from the other set of monkeys on the other island, if the one set learns to use tools, once they hit a certain critical mass, somewhere around, like, say, the 100th monkey, then monkeys on this other island that have never met the other monkeys who are using tools will somehow be able to pick up how to use tools. There's an observable phenomenon that once we get sort of enough people or enough in consciousness to have an experience, that can spread through sort of non-physical means. In constellations land, the way I look at it is it's the field of consciousness in our family. It's very easy for us as humans to feel into this kind of field of experience of consciousness. If you look at how dramatically we get impacted by, say, world events, especially now that we are so tapped in with the internet and the news media cycle and whatnot, you could say that that fear, for example, is an experience that can be widely transmitted to humans. There's a lot of experiences that are able to be felt and experienced through our physiology. So let me step it back. I always get a little lost when I talk about some of this stuff because it is a little out there. Maybe the easiest way to think about it is kind of like the Earth's magnetic field. We don't really know exactly how magnetism works, but we can experience its effects. There is some energetic binding or grouping that we find in the way we relate and the way we relate to our families. And the way we relate with our families to the larger context. So, we have our family field or, family system. We have the city with which we belong to. We may have ethnic groups with which we're connected to, or countries that we have also connected to, often countries of origin. And then you have the whole world as it stands and groupings of humans, right, as its own field, or you've got a larger scale field of all life, like on the planet. You can kind of, in constellations and probably in other formats, you can just sort of tune yourself to what level of information or what level of feeling you want to connect into. We're most awfully in family constellations working with the field of consciousness that includes the family. It may also include things like countries, which have their own energy. If you've ever represented a country in a constellation, it's a very different experience from being human. It doesn't feel like you're a person. It feels like you're a thing or a grouping of people. There are also sometimes you bring in transpersonal, like angelic forces or like sometimes I'll bring in like almost an avatar kind of experience, like love. You bring in, representation for love into the field and notice what effect that has. It's all sort of just ways of playing with consciousness. That's the way that I look at it.
Yeah, kind of the image I'm getting is like of my dining room table. And you're saying like, okay, so this is the playing field, right? And like, who are all the characters? Who are all of the stakeholders in this particular dynamic, this entanglement, and kind of like how do each one of those influence the other in positive and negative ways, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. And depending on your scale, right? If you go meta to the table, you might notice that the table is also a part of the field that is the house, right? And if you go smaller, you've got the placemat. So the placemat's the family, then the table is, let's say the state, that they live in, or the larger context, and then you go to the house, and that's the even bigger context with which they're a part. So, but it's all made of matter. It's just larger and smaller configurations of matter that are all sort of connected to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like something that I really hold in mind when doing ancestor work is that if I had grown up in a culture that practiced ancestral reverence, none of this would be woo. It would be like, it would just be the thing, right? It would just be like, oh yeah, my flesh and blood living relatives and my relatives who are no longer in flesh and blood, right? Who I still have connection with. And I think about it like in terms of results. Like, am I making all this up? Maybe I'm making all this up. Maybe we're making the field up. Does it have impact? Does it work? And that's kind of where I'm focusing. Like, if it's effective, if this is an effective strategy for healing transgenerational trauma, then by all means, let's do it. Right. So it's less. Yeah. I just want to really hold that it's kind of the mechanics of it, or the like understanding the science of it sometimes is important, but sometimes we can just be like, I think, really focused on what's happening, because we're doing this, we're working in these ways with these, naming these energies, naming these dynamics. Yeah. So I wanted to turn the attention a little bit to looking specifically at sexual wounding and sexual trauma. And just see, I think often it's such a alienating experience. If you are the victim of sexual wounding, it's like, it's really hard to hold it in a bigger context because it's so personal, right? It's such a personal wound. And in my work, I'm holding it in the context of there is this larger holding container, which is culture, right? Which you touched on a little bit, like the ways that we live and exist in rape culture. And then there's also this transgenerational thing that might also be part of it, right? Of like, this might be a repetition of a wound that has been passed down through my lines. And so that there's, to just kind of develop this embodied experience of sexual trauma, not as something that is alienating, right? But it's actually part of there's bigger systems at work here.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you would speak to this of tending sexual trauma through the family constellations lens. Like how does that work, and kind of what are the results you get? Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah. Well, and so I will say, first and foremost, that I haven't facilitated constellations for people where sexual trauma has come up, but I have had my own constellations where there have been patterns of sexual trauma in my family that had been impacting me. So I can speak from that place with it. And I will say it's interesting. I was just thinking, and I was reviewing some of the interview questions we asked people, and the sort of standard set doesn't specifically talk about or ask for questions around sexual trauma or sexual history. And so I think that's interesting just to notice that in the way family constellations has, in their own ways, sort of maybe not included that. At least the traditional, just the way it's laid out in the book. And we're dealing mostly with people and their direct experience. So if I know that this is something that someone is dealing with, then we're going to talk about it directly. So I would say that family constellations is going to look at what are the ways in which the person is entangled with things that have happened in the past. And in my own experience, a lot of that was in connection to members of my family who had been sexually abused by other members of my family. And one of the important pieces that sort of came from it was recognizing the importance of witnessing and including, actually seeing that oftentimes some of the people who survived, who are still alive today, who experienced the trauma or abuse, even though in the external world they may be walking around like everything is fine, the constellation showed some really, really deep pain. And again, just a reminder, these are people representing my family members who have no idea what the story is, right? They're just having their experience and reporting it out. The I think this comes back to when we, the silence piece and the inclusion piece, when we exclude or we do not talk about, it's sort of the perfect breeding ground for the shadow. And a family has a shadow, just like we have our own individual shadows. There's, I'd say definitely like the unconscious of a family system can really play this stuff out. There's an important piece in here too about cultural context when it comes to this, and when it comes to victims of sexual abuse or misconduct, is oftentimes, especially if it happens in a family or especially if it happens when they're younger, oftentimes they don't have a sense while it's happening of there being a wrongdoing. They're just playing, or they're feeling like they're receiving love or affection or connection from the person who's doing the violation. And it's oftentimes when they come out and talk about it, or when they hear from other people, that shock kind of comes in of, oh my God, something happened and there was a problem here. So there's a cultural context that actually does help create some of the trauma around a sexual experience. Like when we talk about how people internalize an experience and code it as whether it's traumatic or not. I think that's important for us to look at as we're working with people who come forward who've had these experiences, that the way we respond and the way that we are with them can actually make a big impact in how they code trauma. But as far as the constellations are concerned, it's like any other sort of trauma experience in that it can perpetuate until it gets seen and acknowledged. And so I think, constellation work can give us, the windows into, sometimes very directly into the who and the how of what happened. You can see the dynamics in relationship very clearly. And that's not ever why we're doing a constellation. We're not trying to find who hurt who in the past, but we do want to be able to include that and to allow healing to happen. We oftentimes have to let go of the blame while taking responsibility. And so what that often will look like is the person who did the perpetration sometimes just being able to get to a point where they said, I did that. And the person who was sort of the victim of the perpetration to be able to receive that without necessarily being a perpetrator themselves in the way that they are trying to resolve the pain. Blame more than anything in an unconscious family system keeps stuff stuck. But responsibility and accountability helps move the floodgates. Like, it allows that healing energy to sort of come through. And so this, I think is interesting with family constellations. It's not about punishing anybody, and it's not about justice. Those are sort of more for our world outside. It's much more about being able to acknowledge what's true, what was done, and the impact that it had, which can often be very sad. I mean, perpetrators in these systems and victims in these systems are often, especially in sexual, when they're sexually connected, can be very close in a constellation. There's a bond, there's just like there's a bond with violence in a constellation. I actually find that like people who are perpetrate, it creates a bond, a connection, and between both the victim and the perpetrator. And so once that happens, whether it be sexual or physical, it's going to be there for a while. And so how do you make that bond healthy? Because there's going to be a connection, whether you want it to be there or not. And in the constellation, the easiest way to do that is to really get to a place where you can just take responsibility and clean up your side of the street and own it. And oftentimes that's the healing movement that just needs to happen.
I think one of the most beautiful parts about constellation work that I've taken away is that statement of, I did that, or that happened.
Yeah.
Like really simple acknowledgements of what is or what was,
Yeah.
right? Without kind of trying to change them or make them palatable or heal them. It's just like, that happened to you.
Yeah.
And that kind of, that validation. And I, my own ancestors, you used the word justice, and I want to touch in with that a little bit. My own ancestors have said to me, there is no healing without justice.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of where I'm landing with what justice is not the model that's fed to us through the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
But instead, like exactly what you said, like acknowledgement of impact.
Yeah.
Right. And being willing to not just acknowledge it, not just say, yeah, I did that, but also like feel the suffering that someone, like empathy, right? Of like, oh, like I did that. You were harmed by that. I feel that. I feel the pain of the harm I caused you, whether it was intentional or unintentional. Because I'm in relationship with you and community with you, I'm willing to feel that. And so that big, huge piece that Constellations gives us of letting us see that happens is this crucial first step in, I think, in justice, actually.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that justice is punishment. And I love this about, and I know that there is controversy about this piece of Hellinger's work around sexual violence and this traumatic bonding that happens. But I think it's like, yeah, how could it not, right? We're impacted by each other. And like, I can't say I was violated and that's not connected to a person, right? Of course that's connected to a person. And that, how do I, like, that just gets really complicated, right? that whole tending of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just really appreciate the answer of like, yeah, sometimes when they're actually in the going through the constellation, perpetrators and victims are standing close to each other. And as of course, that's just true, right? Yeah. Even though we would like to push that away. And I think what I hear you saying is that the healing doesn't come from the disinclusion, right?
No.
But it comes from, and my guess is that in family constellations, the perpetrators, the representatives of the perpetration also receive a lot of support for being able to acknowledge that happened. I did that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, yes. Most of the time I'm going to say that that's true. Each constellation is going to show up a little bit differently, but especially if it's in family, if this is a family on family kind of experience, with where these perpetrations lie, there's almost always an undercurrent of love that's there. And there's a truth for everyone that shows up in a constellation that we are supported. We do have the ancestors who came before us who have skillful sets, like that can be useful for us and supportive for us. And that's true of perpetrators as well as victims in the system. People actually respond much more positively when they recognize and have that experience of ancestral support. So we can, in a constellation, often will have resources there for people, for both the perpetrator and the victim, to help support them through a lot of those shifts where those communications are happening. And you mentioned about the willingness to feel about the impact. I think that's one of the things with constellations that's so lovely, is it is both a thinking and feeling experience, and for some people more than others, but you can really feel the difference between when a representative is defending and unable to connect to a feeling experience, and when that flow of love really opens up, and when their empathy connection really opens up. Like it's remarkable to be, and I've played perpetrator roles plenty of times, and to feel when that shift happens. It's the whole family system breathes a sigh of relief. Nobody wants, belonging is the highest priority. Nobody wants people to get cut out of the family. So you mentioned inclusion or disinclusion, and I would say that it's the cutting out of, or the disinclusion, that actually causes the most pain and damage. because we're trying to get rid of the pain, right? We're trying to hide it, or we're trying to pretend it's not there, or we're trying to just, get it out. And what constellations show us and sort of natural healing modalities show us is that it's by including the experience, which is not to get permission to, and not to say, yes, this is so good that this happened, but just to rather just say, okay, this is here, or this experience is here, or it happened. That's the healing movement almost, 99% of the time. And whereas cutting it out, doesn't help. Funny though, if you do include things, oftentimes, especially problems, and you stop resisting them and you resolve it, then they will leave of their own accord. So it's sort of this catch-22. We can't make something go away but by saying okay to it and allowing it to just be, it will often leave on its own.
I want to just draw out the distinction between having boundaries with either living family members or ancestors, mm-hmm. and inclusion. Like inclusion is and welcoming back in, I would say, is for some people a step in their healing process, mm-hmm. right? And for some people, like, the healing is really in the setting of boundaries, like the saying, no, you don't get to do this. And I just feel like that's a really important, it's kind of like the forgiveness narrative of, like, to forgive is not necessarily always the highest, most enlightened thing you can do. Like, sometimes, like, really sticking to your guns about your boundaries is the highest thing that you can do, right? For the good of your descendants, even. Mm-hmm. And so just, like, really wanting to make space that, like, I don't think you or I are saying, like, let's include perpetrators at Thanksgiving dinner because, like, that's for the good of all involved, right? That's not what we're saying here. But we're saying to be inclusive of experiences, to, like, instead of kind of disavowing parts of ourselves or disavowing experiences that we had, to be able to name that we have had those experiences, that those things have happened. Yeah.
And I would say too that, what applies in a constellation is not necessarily super applicable in everyday life. Like, I wouldn't, some of the principles are there, but the practicalities are not, being able to have a conversation with a perpetrator in your family, the way it happens in a constellation is not, I wouldn't recommend doing that in your regular life, or trying to follow the orders of love, as they're called in constellations, in your regular relationships. Like, I don't find that that's always useful. Definitely, yeah, it's important to speak your truth and to state your needs and have your boundaries for the things that you need to. And it is more about including on a greater level the experience of things happening, but protect yourself, for sure. That's important.
Yeah, I really like that. I want to finish by just asking you about what the impact is when we do this work. Because I really heard the thing you just said, which is, don't try this at home, kids. It's like, this is a very specific transpersonal tool modality that is used, mm-hmm. right, in these particular ways. And when we're doing a family constellation, yes to inclusion, right? That is part of this process, is making sure that all family members are included, no matter what they did. But it doesn't translate out to your life necessarily. Yeah. And that can be a very distinct, like, this is where I work with these and this is where I don't work with these. But I am curious of your thoughts on the impact, paying attention to healing ancestral trauma. Like, if I'm, if I do a constellation and my great-grandmother's sexual abuse shows up, right? And then we make changes in the field to make that right. Mm-hmm. What do you think the impact is on current and future generations?
Well, I will say that, so because our constellations are outcome focused, you generally have a place in your life where you're paying attention to your current experience. And so we rarely do a constellation that's like, okay, my grandma was sexually abused and I want to make sure she's okay. Because the dead are dead and they don't need it to be better for them, generally. It's mostly us who have the problem with what happened to our ancestors in the past. So we will be able to kind of do the constellation around whatever the personal issue is, and then notice how it shifts in your world. We never know how healing is going to happen. Like, the specific outcome is going to look a particular way. Did a constellation for someone around work and finding like sort of their job that was really be representative of how they are in the world, for example. And the constellation was done. It was beautiful. They were super happy. And 2 weeks later, the job they were really hoping to get fell through. And so they called me and they're like, so do you have a guarantee? Do you know how long this is going to take or any of that? And we really don't. But we can pay attention to and just be open to things shifting. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, a new job came up that's actually even better and more in alignment with what he's looking for. When it comes to for like working with the trauma, it's like, so I don't have descendants, I don't have kids, I'm not sure that I can speak to what the impact will be for them, except to say that I do believe, and this is more of a faith thing, that the work I do has an impact, because every time I go into a constellation with my family, people get better. These are representations in my family, the sticking points, the trauma, like the way my mom shows up in my constellation now is very different from the way she used to show up. The way these family members show up, like they show up easier and lighter and much more resourceful and supportive to us. And I feel that in my daily life. I think the benefit of doing this work, again, we're doing it for us. Like they're rooting for us to succeed. Our ancestors want us to do well in this world. And when we do this kind of work, we can notice our experience getting better. And if you're a constellations junkie, like myself or a fan, you when you go back in, you'll notice that things feel different, both for you and for your ancestors, the way they show up represented. So, there are rare occasions where things don't shift. And you can't promise that things are going to shift on a timeline. Some people, things shift in a couple of years, but I'd say for a majority of the people that I work with, they notice a shift in their experience pretty quickly.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing all of your accumulated wisdom about this really special modality. It's just really great I feel like it's a really useful tool that's very immediately applicable and accessible, like you said, and I just want to invite folks who haven't experienced constellation work to check it out. There are numerous opportunities, I think, in all parts of the world, and it's very low bar of admittance. I think the constellation I did, it's like you can just go, or sometimes it's like $5. It's not, it's really helpful. And also that when you go to a constellation, even if it's not you who's being constellated, I don't even know if that's the right verb, but if it's not you who's the representative of the issue of the issue that's being disentangled, there's benefit to be had just from being in the experience, and kind of you get insight on your own family stuff. So just, wanting to invite people to your constellations, which I know, Peter, that you offer every second Tuesday, and you have one. The next one is going to be Tuesday, December 12th, and that's in San Francisco at 7:15.
Correct.
And you also have something called the Empathy Play Shop for Self-Awareness.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about that? Well, let me just say it's December 3rd, Sunday, December 3rd from 2 to 5. It's in San Francisco. People can find out about it on your website, which is petertouchard.com, or on Facebook. And the Facebook page is Sacred Play SF. Sacred Play SF on Facebook. So do you want to say anything about the Empathy Play Shop? It sounds fascinating.
Yeah. So that just sort of came to me one day. I know a lot of friends who identify as empaths, and a lot of the material that people talk about, if you go online and you Google empaths or empathies, a lot of the articles are written from a perspective that I don't really share, that we're somehow victims to our feelings, and that we have to be really careful when dealing with our feeling experiences. And what I wanted to do is find out what are the experiences of people who are deeply feeling or feeling other people's feelings, to play with some of the different maneuvers of consciousness that I've encountered with the work that I've done, for how we can both step in and out of our experience and the experience of others. And also just offer a different perspective, that maybe what is happening with empathy community is actually a really good opportunity for us to look at our own stuff. That if we are feeling angry when someone else is angry, that anger exists in our world, or when we're feeling sad, that there's sadness in our world as well, and that that can be really useful for us to, in our own personal growth journey, to be able to identify what's inside and shift it, because we all have the power to change our feeling and shift our state. It's just a skill that sort of gets developed over time. So it's my very first one of these. I'm happy to have anybody who identifies as empath or empath adjacent to come and share their experience.
What about empath allies? Can
empath allies come? Yeah, and I'm actually, I think anyone who can say, I've had an experience of feeling with another person, you've got empathy, right? And there's quite a few people who don't, have that awareness at this point, and that's fine. This is not for developing it so much, although I'm sure something will be coming soon. But yeah, empath allies, that could work. We'd love fun to play with it.
Okay, great. And again, that is Sunday, December 3rd in San Francisco from 2 to 5. You can find out about it on facebook.com/sacredplaysf. And Peter, thank you again. It's just been lovely to chat with you today. Yeah. And I want to thank folks for listening to this episode. And if you feel inspired by what you heard today, it would be awesome if you would subscribe, rate, and review Bespoken Bones on iTunes. And doing that helps the podcast thrive, and it helps it reach more folks who can benefit. And I am Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and every new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.